Within the shadowed archives of Saint Augustine Seminary in rural Pennsylvania, there exists a photograph that no one speaks of. 12 young men in pristine white vestments, their faces radiant with faith, standing before an altar that would become their tomb. The date inscribed on the back reads May 15, 1847, the day these seminarians were to be ordained as priests. Not one of them ever said their first Mass. Not one of them was ever seen alive again after that photograph was taken. For over a century and 70 years, the Catholic Church has maintained that the entire ordination class of 1847 died in a tragic fire that consumed the seminary's east wing. But the charred remains of the building tell a different story, one that involves 13 sets of footprints leading into the chapel basement, and only one leading out. The church sealed the basement permanently in 1848, claiming structural damage. They've never allowed anyone inside since. What really happened to those 12 young priests remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets in American Catholic history, buried beneath layers of official silence and deliberate misdirection. Before we continue with the story of what the Church has hidden for nearly 2 centuries, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the truth behind history's darkest mysteries. If you have the courage to face what others fear to know, subscribe now and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Let's discover together what really happened to those 12 souls who vanished on the night they were meant to serve God. But to understand the true horror of what occurred at Saint Augustine Seminary, we must first journey back to a time when faith and fear walked hand in hand through the Pennsylvania wilderness. The year 1847 found the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, nestled in the rolling hills 40 miles west of Philadelphia, a community of barely 300 souls bound together by shared struggle and unwavering Catholic faith. Founded by Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine, Millbrook existed as a pocket of Catholicism in a predominantly Protestant region where anti-Catholic sentiment ran as deep as the mountain streams that fed their modest farms. Saint Augustine Seminary stood like a fortress of faith on the town's eastern edge, its imposing Gothic stone walls rising 3 stories above the surrounding countryside. Built in 1823 by Bishop Francis Kenrick himself, the seminary served as the training ground for priests destined to serve the growing Catholic population across Pennsylvania's frontier. The building's architecture spoke of permanence and divine purpose. Thick limestone walls, soaring arched windows, and a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the valley. The seminary's reputation extended far beyond Pennsylvania's borders. Young men from across the eastern United States came to study under the guidance of Father Superior Marcus Whitmore, a brilliant theologian who had trained at the prestigious Seminary of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. Father Whitmore demanded absolute dedication from his seminarians, believing that only through complete surrender to God's will could a man become worthy of the priesthood. His methods were rigorous, some whispered harsh, but they produced priests of exceptional faith and discipline. The class of 1847 represented the cream of American Catholic youth. 12 young men, aged between 22 and 28, who had completed their 6 years of study with distinction. Their names were inscribed in the seminary's Golden Book. Michael O'Brien from Boston, Thomas Kellerman from Baltimore, Patrick Murphy from New York, James Fitzgerald from Philadelphia, and 8 others whose families had sacrificed everything to see their sons serve God. Among them stood out Francis Benedetto, the son of Italian immigrants who had settled in Pittsburgh. At 24, Francis possessed an intellectual brilliance that impressed even Father Whitmore. He spoke 5 languages fluently, had memorized vast portions of scripture, and demonstrated a theological understanding that seemed to transcend his years. His fellow seminarians looked to him as their natural leader, and many believed he would one day become a bishop. The seminarians lived in Spartan cells on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, rising each morning at 4 for lauds, followed by meditation, Mass, breakfast, and 8 hours of study. Their days ended with compline at 9, after which the great silence began. No word was to be spoken until the following morning's prayers. This rhythm had governed their lives for 6 years, preparing them for the sacred responsibility of shepherding souls. But in the weeks leading up to their ordination, something had begun to change within the seminary's walls. The seminarians spoke in whispers of strange dreams that visited them nightly, visions of a 13th figure dressed in black vestments, standing at the altar during their future ordination ceremony. They described the figure's face as obscured by shadow, but its presence filled them with a mixture of terror and inexplicable attraction. Father Whitmore had noticed their increasing restlessness. During their final examinations, several seminarians had given answers that troubled him deeply. When asked about the nature of sacrifice, Francis Benedetto had spoken not of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, but of the greater sacrifice that opens the door to true understanding. When questioned about obedience, Thomas Kellerman had replied that obedience to God sometimes requires disobedience to man. The other faculty members, Father Jonathan Mills, Father David Brennan, and Father Peter Kowalski, had expressed their own concerns to Father Whitmore. The seminarians had been discovered in the chapel at unusual hours, kneeling in prayer formation around a circle drawn in ash on the floor. When confronted, they claimed to have no memory of how they came to be there. Their explanation was always the same. They had been called to pray by a voice that spoke in their dreams. As May 15th approached, the entire town of Millbrook prepared for the ordination ceremony. It would be the largest such event in the region's history, with Bishop Kenrick himself traveling from Philadelphia to perform the sacred ritual. Families from across the eastern seaboard had already begun arriving, filling the town's modest inn and staying with local families who opened their homes to the visitors. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 in the morning, to be followed by a grand celebration that would last until evening. The seminarians would speak their final vows, receive the sacred oils of ordination, and transform from students into priests, empowered to celebrate Mass, hear confessions, and guide souls to salvation. It was to be the culmination of their years of preparation, the moment when their lives would be forever consecrated to God's service. But on the night of May 14th, as the seminarians knelt for their final evening of prayer before ordination, none of them could have imagined that they were about to become part of a mystery that would haunt the Catholic Church for generations to come. The evening of May 14th, 1847, began like any other in the life of Saint Augustine Seminary. The seminarians had completed their final examinations and spent the afternoon in quiet reflection, preparing their souls for the sacred transformation that awaited them with the dawn. As darkness settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, the familiar rhythm of Compline echoed through the stone corridors, marking the beginning of what should have been their last night as students. Father Whitmore conducted the evening prayers with particular solemnity, his voice carrying extra weight as he blessed the 12 young men who would soon join the ranks of the priesthood. The seminary's chapel, lit by dozens of candles, cast dancing shadows across the ancient stones as the seminarians knelt in their usual formation. But those who observed them closely noted something unsettling. Their eyes seemed fixed not on the altar, but on some invisible point in the air above it. At precisely 9 o'clock, the great silence began. The seminarians filed out of the chapel in their customary order, their soft footfalls on the stone floor the only sound in the vast building. Father Whitmore watched them go, noting how Francis Benedetto paused at the chapel door and glanced back with an expression that seemed almost expectant. What happened next would forever change the course of Saint Augustine Seminary's history. Brother Thomas Aquinas, the seminary's elderly porter, was making his final rounds when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. From deep within the building came the resonant tones of the chapel's great bell, tolling not the customary pattern of the hours, but a slow, measured cadence that seemed to pulse with its own dark rhythm. 12 tolls, then a pause, then 12 more. The pattern repeated 3 times before falling silent. Brother Thomas knew the bell schedule by heart. No bell was supposed to ring during the great silence. More disturbing still, the bell tower was locked each night, and Father Whitmore kept the only key. Yet the sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze voice of the seminary's own bell, calling out across the sleeping valley. As Brother Thomas hurried toward the bell tower, he encountered Father Mills emerging from his quarters, his face pale with concern. "Brother, did you hear?" Father Mills began, but his words were cut short by another sound that sent ice through both men's veins. From the chapel came the sound of chanting, not the familiar Latin of their daily prayers, but something older, more primal. The voices were unmistakably those of the seminarians, but the words they spoke seemed to come from no Christian liturgy. The chanting rose and fell in waves, punctuated by responses that echoed strangely in the stone chamber. Father Mills and Brother Thomas approached the chapel doors with mounting dread. The massive oak portals, which had stood open during evening prayers, were now sealed shut. When Father Mills pressed his ear to the wood, he could hear the seminarians' voices clearly, but the words they spoke seemed to shift and change, even as he listened, as if the very air was transforming the sounds. Father Whitmore appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with urgent purpose. In his hand he carried a ring of keys, his face set in grim determination. "The bell tower is locked," he announced grimly. "No one rang that bell from above." The three men stood before the chapel doors, the chanting continuing beyond the thick oak barriers. Father Whitmore selected a large iron key from his ring, the master key that opened every door in the seminary. But when he inserted it into the lock, it would not turn. The mechanism, which had functioned perfectly for over 20 years, seemed to have frozen solid. "Get Father Brennan and Father Kowalski," Father Whitmore ordered Brother Thomas. "Something is very wrong here." As Brother Thomas hurried away, the chanting within the chapel began to change. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and underneath them both priests could hear another sound, footsteps descending what sounded like stone steps. But the chapel had no stairs. The floor was level throughout, with only the raised altar at the far end. Father Brennan and Father Kowalski arrived within minutes, their faces reflecting the same mixture of concern and bewilderment that gripped their colleagues. Together, the four priests worked to open the chapel doors, but no amount of effort could budge the ancient locks. It was as if the doors had been sealed from within by some force beyond their understanding. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to press against their ears like a physical weight. Father Whitmore called out to the seminarians, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the corridor. No response came. The priests spent the next hour attempting to breach the chapel doors, but their efforts proved futile. Finally, Father Whitmore made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We'll have to go around," he announced. "The sacristy door connects to the chapel from the outside." The 5 men, the 4 priests and Brother Thomas, made their way through the seminary's corridors to the external door that led to the sacristy. This smaller entrance, used primarily for storing vestments and sacred vessels, provided direct access to the chapel's interior. Father Whitmore's key worked smoothly in this lock, and the door swung open without resistance. What they found inside defied every expectation and challenged every assumption about what was possible within the sacred walls of Saint Augustine Seminary. The chapel was empty, not merely vacant, but impossibly, completely empty. The 12 seminarians who had been chanting only moments before had vanished without a trace. Their prayer books lay scattered across the floor, pages torn and scattered like autumn leaves. The candles that had illuminated their evening prayers had been extinguished, leaving only the cold smell of recently snuffed wax. But it was the altar that truly shook the priests to their core. The massive stone structure, which had stood unchanged for over 20 years, had been moved. Not shifted slightly, but completely relocated to reveal a gaping hole in the floor beneath. A hole that descended into darkness so complete that their lamplight could not penetrate its depths. Father Whitmore approached the opening with trembling steps. The hole was perfectly circular, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, with stone steps carved into its walls, spiraling downward into the earth. The stonework was old, far older than the seminary itself, and covered with symbols that none of the priests recognized. The air that rose from the depths carried a strange, sweet scent that seemed to cling to their nostrils and make their heads spin. "This is impossible," Father Brennan whispered, his voice barely audible. The chapel was built on solid ground. The foundation records show no basement, no crypt, nothing. Father Kowalski knelt beside the opening, holding his lamp as far down as he dared. "The steps go down at least 20 feet, he reported. "I can see more symbols carved into the walls, but I can't make out where they lead." As the priests debated what to do next, Brother Thomas made a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the night's events. Near the altar, partially hidden beneath a scattered prayer book, he found a folded piece of paper. The parchment was old, its edges yellowed with age, and the handwriting upon it was in a hand none of them recognized. Father Whitmore read the document aloud, his voice growing more strained with each word. "To those who seek the truth beyond the veil of mortal understanding, know that the path to true enlightenment requires sacrifice beyond what the weak-hearted can comprehend. The 12 who descend this night do so of their own will, called by voices that speak from depths older than any church, older than any faith built by human hands. They go to serve a purpose higher than any earthly ordination can provide. Seek them not in the world above, for they have chosen to serve in the world below. Their sacrifice opens the door for others to follow. The 13th witness remains to tell their tale." The document was unsigned, but the implications were clear and terrifying. The seminarians had not been taken against their will. They had gone willingly into the depths beneath the chapel. But who or what had called them there, and who was the 13th witness mentioned in the note? Father Whitmore folded the parchment carefully and placed it in his vestment pocket. "We must search the opening," he announced, though his voice betrayed his reluctance. "If there's any chance they're still alive." But before any of them could make the descent, a new sound echoed from the depths below, the sound of stone grinding against stone as if massive blocks were shifting into place. The priests watched in horror as the opening began to close, the stone steps disappearing section by section as some mechanism sealed the passage from below. Within minutes, the hole was completely covered by what appeared to be solid stone floor. The altar had somehow moved back into its original position, and the chapel looked exactly as it had before the night's events began. If not for the scattered prayer books and the lingering sweet scent in the air, the priests might have believed they had experienced some shared delusion. But the seminarians were gone. 12 young men who had been preparing for ordination had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would torment Saint Augustine Seminary for generations to come. As dawn broke over the Pennsylvania countryside, the bells of Saint Augustine Seminary remained silent. There would be no ordination ceremony that day, no celebration of new priests joining the ranks of the faithful. Instead, there would be only the beginning of a cover-up that would span more than a century and 70 years. The families and guests who had traveled from across the eastern seaboard to witness the ordination were told that a tragic fire had claimed the lives of all 12 seminarians during the night. The east wing of the seminary was indeed set ablaze later that morning, destroying any evidence of the night's true events. Official records would show that the young men had been trapped in their dormitory and overcome by smoke, their bodies consumed by the flames. But those who knew the truth, the 4 priests and Brother Thomas, would carry the weight of that night's events for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed something that challenged every foundation of their faith, something that suggested the existence of forces and purposes beyond the scope of Christian understanding. And somewhere in the depths beneath St. Augustine Seminary, in chambers that predated the arrival of Christianity in the New World, 12 young men who had once prepared to serve God were beginning their service to something far older and far more demanding than any earthly church. The official investigation into the fire at Saint Augustine Seminary lasted exactly 3 days. Church officials from Philadelphia arrived within hours of the reported tragedy, their black carriages creating a solemn procession through the streets of Millbrook. They examined the charred remains of the East Wing, took statements from the surviving faculty, and issued their final report with an efficiency that seemed almost rehearsed. The report concluded that a lamp had been knocked over in one of the dormitory rooms, igniting the building's aged wooden fixtures. The seminarians had been trapped by smoke and flames, their bodies so completely consumed that no remains could be recovered. The tragedy was ruled an accident, the result of negligence during the young men's final night of preparation. But Father Whitmore and his colleagues knew the truth was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. In the weeks following the fire, the seminary's atmosphere changed dramatically. The remaining students, those in their earlier years of study, spoke in hushed tones about dreams that visited them nightly. They reported seeing 12 figures in white vestments walking the corridors after midnight, always moving toward the chapel but never arriving. The dreams always ended the same way, with the sound of stone grinding against stone and a voice calling from depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical world. Father Whitmore began experiencing his own visions. Each night, as he knelt for his private prayers, he would see Francis Benedetto standing at the altar of the chapel, his face serene, but his eyes reflecting a knowledge that seemed to transcend human understanding. The apparition would gesture toward the floor where the opening had appeared, and Father Whitmore would hear, not with his ears but with his mind, the words, "The door remains open for those who truly seek." The chapel itself became a source of constant unease. During daily Mass, the priests would notice that the altar seemed to shift slightly, as if the stone beneath it was settling. The sweet scent that had risen from the depths would return at random times, usually during moments of particular solemnity. Several times, brothers and faculty members reported hearing faint chanting echoing from the chapel during the night hours, always in that same unknown language the seminarians had spoken. Brother Thomas, whose porter duties required him to make rounds throughout the building, began to document strange occurrences with obsessive detail. His private journal, which would later be discovered in the seminary archives, recorded phenomena that defied rational explanation. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors that opened and closed without cause, and most disturbing of all, the periodic appearance of 13 shadows in the chapel when only 12 candles were lit. The number 13 began to appear with unsettling frequency throughout the seminary. Students would count 13 stations of the cross instead of the traditional 14. 13 candles would appear on the altar, despite careful inventory showing only 12. Most disturbing of all, 13 places would sometimes be set in the refectory, though only 12 people were expected for meals. Father Mills, who had served as the seminary's librarian for over 15 years, made a discovery that shed new light on the night's events. While cataloguing books in the theological section, he found a volume that had not been there before, a leather-bound manuscript written in Latin with extensive annotations in what appeared to be Francis Benedetto's handwriting. The book, titled De Mysteriis Antiquis, on ancient mysteries, contained detailed descriptions of pre-Christian religious practices that had supposedly been practiced by indigenous peoples long before European settlement. The text suggested that certain sacred sites retained spiritual power that could be accessed through specific rituals and sacrifices. Most chilling of all, the manuscript included architectural diagrams that showed underground chambers beneath religious buildings, chambers designed to facilitate contact with entities that existed beyond the physical world. Father Mills brought the book to Father Whitmore, who examined it with growing horror. The annotations in Francis Benedetto's hand revealed that the young seminarian had been studying these ancient practices for months, possibly years. His notes suggested that he had come to believe that true spiritual enlightenment required embracing powers and knowledge that the Christian Church had deliberately suppressed. More disturbing still were the personal letters that Father Mills discovered hidden within the book's pages. Written by Francis to his fellow seminarians, the letters revealed a growing conviction that their ordination was not an end but a beginning. a preparation for a far greater service than the Catholic Church could offer. The letter spoke of the old ways and the true path to divine understanding, suggesting that the seminarians had been planning their descent into the depths for months. The final letter, dated just 3 days before the ordination ceremony, contained a passage that made Father Whitmore's blood run cold. "The 13 who serve below have waited centuries for successors. We 12 have been chosen to join them, to become the bridge between the world of light and the world of shadow. Our earthly ordination would bind us to serve man's limited understanding of God. Our true ordination will bind us to serve forces that shaped the world before man drew breath." As winter settled over the Pennsylvania countryside, the strange events at Saint Augustine Seminary began to affect the surrounding community. Local farmers reported that their livestock refused to graze in fields that faced the seminary, and several families claimed that their children had begun speaking in their sleep, using words that sounded like the ancient language heard in the chapel. The town's physician, Dr. Samuel Richardson, documented an unusual number of cases involving disturbing dreams and night terrors among Millbrook's residents. His private notes described patients who reported identical visions: 12 young men in white vestments descending stone steps, followed by a 13th figure whose face remained shrouded in shadow. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the change in Father Whitmore himself. The priest, who had once been known for his intellectual rigor and unwavering faith, began to exhibit signs of profound spiritual distress. He would spend hours alone in the chapel, kneeling on the spot where the opening had appeared, his lips moving in what appeared to be prayer, but which those who listened closely recognized as repetition of the same ancient syllables the seminarians had chanted. Father Brennan, growing increasingly concerned about his superior's mental state, began to keep his own secret journal. His entries reveal a man struggling to reconcile his faith with experiences that challenged every theological foundation he had ever accepted. He wrote of finding Father Whitmore in the chapel at impossible hours, apparently deep in conversation with invisible presences. Most disturbing of all, he recorded that Father Whitmore had begun to refer to himself as the 13th witness, the same title mentioned in the mysterious note found after the seminarian's disappearance. As the first anniversary of the tragic fire approached, the seminary's enrollment had dwindled to fewer than 20 students. Families who had once considered it an honor to send their sons to Saint Augustine now avoided the institution entirely. Rumors spread throughout the Catholic communities of Pennsylvania about the cursed seminary, where young men disappeared and strange voices echoed through the night. Church officials in Philadelphia began to discuss the possibility of closing Saint Augustine Seminary permanently. The building had become a liability, a source of scandal and supernatural speculation that threatened to undermine the Church's authority in the region. But before any final decision could be made, an event occurred that would forever change the course of the seminary's history and reveal the true extent of the horror that had taken root beneath its foundations. The event began with a letter that arrived at the seminary on the morning of May 14, 1848, exactly 1 year after the seminarian's disappearance. The envelope bore no return address, and the handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar to any of the faculty. Father Whitmore opened it with trembling hands, his face growing pale as he read the contents aloud to his assembled colleagues. The letter that arrived on that grey May morning contained only a few lines, but their implications would shatter whatever remained of the seminary's peace. To the faithful servants of Saint Augustine Seminary, the year of preparation is complete. The door beneath the sacred altar opens once more tonight. The 13th witness must choose, remain in the world of light and watch your flock scatter like leaves before the wind, or descend to join those who serve the deeper truth. The choice has always been yours, Marcus. The 12 who wait below call your name in voices that carry the weight of centuries. Come to us freely, or watch your life's work crumble to dust. The letter was unsigned, but Father Whitmore recognized the handwriting. It was Francis Benedetto's elegant script, unchanged despite a year beneath the earth. Father Brennan, who had been watching his superior with growing concern, saw the color drain from Father Whitmore's face as he read the letter. "Marcus," he said softly, using his friend's Christian name for the first time in years. "What does it say?" Father Whitmore's response came in a voice barely above a whisper. "They're calling me home." The other priests demanded to see the letter, but Father Whitmore clutched it to his chest with desperate intensity. His eyes, which had once burned with intellectual fervor, now held the glazed look of a man who had stared too long into an abyss that had finally begun to stare back. As evening approached, the seminary's remaining students and faculty noticed a change in the building's atmosphere. The stone walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. The sweet scent that had appeared intermittently throughout the year now permeated every corridor, growing stronger with each passing hour. Father Kowalski, who had been documenting the seminary's decline in his private correspondence with church officials in Philadelphia, wrote his final letter that afternoon. In it, he described Father Whitmore's deteriorating condition and his growing conviction that something ancient and malevolent had taken root beneath the seminary's foundations. He ended the letter with a request for immediate assistance and a warning that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. As darkness fell over the Pennsylvania countryside, the familiar routine of evening prayers took on an ominous quality. The remaining students, fewer than 20 young men who had chosen to stay despite the seminary's reputation, knelt in the chapel with visible nervousness. They could feel the building's anticipation, as if the very stones were waiting for some momentous event. Father Whitmore conducted the prayers with an intensity that bordered on desperation. His voice, usually calm and measured, rose and fell with emotional peaks that made the students exchange worried glances. When he reached the final blessing, his hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the prayer book. After the students had been dismissed to their dormitories, the 4 remaining priests gathered in Father Whitmore's study. The room, which had once served as a sanctuary of theological learning, now felt like a tomb. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages torn and scattered. The walls, once lined with centuries of religious scholarship, now displayed only empty shelves and faded rectangles where paintings had hung. "Marcus," Father Mills said gently, "you need to leave this place. Whatever happened here, whatever is still happening, it's destroying you." Father Whitmore turned to face his colleagues, and they saw in his eyes a depth of knowledge that no mortal man should possess. "You don't understand," he said, his voice carrying an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the building. "They didn't disappear. They were chosen. They were called to serve something greater than any of us can comprehend." "Listen to yourself," Father Brennan pleaded. "You're talking about abandoning everything we've sworn to uphold, our vows, our faith, our responsibility to these students." "Our responsibility?" Father Whitmore laughed, a sound that sent ice through his colleagues' veins. "We've been teaching them to serve a diminished God, a God constrained by human understanding and limited by human fears. What lies beneath this chapel predates Christianity by millennia. It was old when the first human beings learned to speak. The seminarians who descended understood this truth. As Father Whitmore spoke, the priests became aware of a new sound echoing through the building. From somewhere below their feet came the rhythmic pounding of stone against stone, as if massive blocks were being moved by unseen hands. The sound grew stronger and more insistent, creating a vibration that could be felt in their bones. "They're preparing," Father Whitmore announced with certainty. "The door will open again tonight, and this time it will remain open. The 13 who serve below will finally have their witness in the world above." Father Kowalski stood abruptly, his face pale with determination. "I'm going to the chapel. If there's some kind of opening down there, if there's any chance those boys are still alive." "They're not alive," Father Whitmore interrupted, "not in any sense that you would understand. They've been transformed. elevated, given purpose beyond the petty concerns of earthly existence. Tonight, I joined them. The pounding from below grew louder, more insistent. Dust began to fall from the ceiling as the entire building shook with each impact. The priests could hear the remaining students in their dormitories, their voices raised in confused alarm as their beds rattled against the walls. Father Mills made a decision that would save his life, but haunt his dreams for decades to come. "We need to evacuate the building," he announced. "Get the students out, send word to Philadelphia, and seal this place permanently." But Father Whitmore was already moving toward the door, his steps purposeful and determined. "You can try to stop what's happening," he said over his shoulder, "but you cannot change what has already begun. The door opens tonight, and the 13th witness takes his place among the chosen." The three priests followed Father Whitmore through the corridors of the seminary, their footsteps echoing off stone walls that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Students emerged from their dormitories, their faces reflecting the terror that had gripped the entire building. The air itself seemed to thicken with each step they took toward the chapel. As they approached the chapel doors, the priests could see light emanating from beneath the heavy oak barriers. Not the warm glow of candles, but a cold, blue radiance that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The pounding from below had evolved into a complex rhythm, like a heartbeat that originated from the very foundations of the building. Father Whitmore placed his hand on the chapel door, and it swung open without resistance. The sight that greeted them would be burned into their memories for the rest of their lives. The chapel's floor had opened once again, revealing the spiral staircase that descended into the earth. But this time, the opening was larger, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, and the blue light that rose from its depths cast everything in an otherworldly glow. The 12 missing seminarians stood around the opening's edge, their white vestments now gleaming with that same cold radiance. But they were no longer the young men who had disappeared a year ago. Their faces had taken on an ageless quality, their eyes reflecting knowledge that seemed to span centuries. They moved with perfect synchronization, their gestures forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. "Marcus," they said in unison, their combined voices creating harmonics that made the chapel's stone walls ring like bells. "The circle is almost complete. Take your place among us, and the work can truly begin." In the center of the circle, rising from the depths of the opening, stood a figure that made the priests' minds recoil from comprehension. It was tall and draped in robes that seemed to be cut from the darkness itself. Where its face should have been, there was only a void that seemed to pull at their sanity like a physical force. "The 13th witness." The figure spoke, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The one who will carry our message to the world above. The bridge between what was and what will be." Father Whitmore stepped forward, his face radiant with an expression that combined ecstasy and terror in equal measure. "I understand now," he said, his voice carrying the same impossible harmonics as the seminarians. "I've been chosen to serve a purpose greater than any earthly church could provide." As he approached the opening, the 3 remaining priests finally understood the true horror of what they were witnessing. This was not merely about the disappearance of 12 young men. It was about the transformation of human souls into something utterly foreign to God's creation. The seminarians had not been killed. They had been recruited into service of entities that existed in the spaces between light and shadow, beings that predated human civilization and sought to reclaim dominion over the world above. Father Brennan, driven by a desperate courage that surprised even himself, lunged forward to stop his superior. But the seminarians moved with inhuman speed, their hands grasping him with strength that seemed to flow from the earth itself. As they held him, he could feel something pressing against his mind. Alien thoughts that sought to overwhelm his consciousness with visions of cosmic truth and universal insignificance. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Francis Benedetto said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The door has been opened, and those who serve below have been patient for far too long. The 13th witness will ensure that our message reaches every corner of the world above." The struggle in the chapel intensified as the remaining priests realized the full scope of what they were facing. This was not a simple case of religious apostasy or even demonic possession. It was something far more ancient and infinitely more dangerous. The entities that had claimed the seminarians operated according to laws that predated human understanding, and their patience was finally exhausted. Father Kowalski, drawing upon reserves of faith he didn't know he possessed, began to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin. The words seemed to cause the blue light to flicker and dim, and for a moment the seminarians' perfect synchronization faltered. The tall figure in the center of the circle turned its attention to him, and Father Kowalski felt his mind being probed by something vast and utterly alien. "Your prayers have no power here." The figure spoke, its voice creating harmonics that made the chapel's stones groan. "This place was sacred long before your carpenter God walked among men. The earth itself remembers older truths, older powers. Your faith is a flickering candle in the face of an eternal darkness." But Father Kowalski continued his prayer, his voice growing stronger with each word. The other priests joined him, their combined voices creating a barrier of sacred sound that seemed to hold the transformed seminarians at bay. For a moment, it appeared that their faith might be enough to break whatever hold the entities had over Father Whitmore. Then Francis Benedetto spoke a single word in the ancient language, and the very air in the chapel seemed to solidify. The priests' voices died in their throats as an invisible force pressed against their lungs, making each breath a struggle. The blue light from the opening intensified, casting their shadows in impossible directions that seemed to move independently of their bodies. Father Whitmore, standing at the edge of the opening, turned to face his colleagues one final time. His face had taken on the same ageless quality as the seminarians, but his eyes still held a flicker of the man they had known for so many years. "Tell them," he said, his voice barely recognizable as human. "Tell them that we found what we were truly seeking. Tell them that the door between worlds has been opened, and soon others will follow the path we have chosen." Father Mills, fighting against the pressure that seemed to crush his chest, managed to gasp out a single word. "Marcus, please." But Father Whitmore was already descending the stone steps, his figure growing smaller as he disappeared into the blue radiance. The seminarians began to follow, their movements creating patterns that hurt to observe directly. As each one disappeared into the depths, the pressure in the chapel grew stronger, threatening to drive the remaining priests to their knees. The tall figure in the center raised what might have been arms, and the opening began to expand. The stone floor cracked and shifted as the circle of blue light grew wider, threatening to encompass the entire chapel. The priests realized with growing horror that the entities below were not merely claiming individual souls. They were attempting to breach the barrier between their realm and the world above. Father Brennan, still held by the inhuman strength of the seminarians, felt his consciousness beginning to fragment under the assault of alien thoughts. He saw visions of vast underground cities populated by beings that had ruled the earth before humanity learned to stand upright. He witnessed ceremonies conducted in caverns that extended to the planet's core, rituals designed to tear holes in reality itself. Most terrifying of all, he saw the future they were working toward, a world where the boundaries between dimensions had been permanently shattered, where creatures of shadow walked freely among men. Just when it seemed that the priest's sanity would be completely overwhelmed, an unexpected salvation arrived. Brother Thomas, who had been awakening the students and preparing them for evacuation, burst into the chapel, carrying a large wooden cross that had hung in the seminary's main corridor for over 20 years. The cross had been carved from wood, taken from a tree that allegedly grew on the site where St. Patrick had converted the Irish to Christianity. The moment Brother Thomas crossed the chapel's threshold, the blue light flickered and dimmed. The seminarians' hold on Father Brennan loosened, and the crushing pressure in the air began to ease. The ancient wood of the cross seemed to resonate with a power that predated even the entities below, drawing upon centuries of faith and devotion that had been invested in its carved surface. "The old wood remembers older truths," Brother Thomas said, his voice carrying surprising authority. "This tree was sacred before Christianity came to Ireland, and it remembers the bargains that were made when the first missionaries arrived. Light and shadow agreed to coexist, each in their proper realm." The tall figure turned its attention to Brother Thomas, and the porter felt his mind being probed by something vast and ancient. But the cross in his hands seemed to provide protection, creating a barrier that the entity could not penetrate. "You speak of bargains made in darkness," the figure said, its voice carrying notes of grudging respect. "But those agreements did not account for willing servants. These 12 came to us freely, offering their souls in exchange for knowledge. The 13th seals the compact, opening the door for others to follow." "They were deceived," Brother Thomas replied, holding the cross higher. "Shown visions of cosmic truth when they were really being prepared for slavery. The door you seek to open will bring only darkness to the world above." The seminarians, who had been moving toward the opening with mechanical precision, suddenly stopped. For the first time since their transformation, their faces showed individual expressions: confusion, doubt, and what might have been remembered humanity. Francis Benedetto's voice, when he spoke, carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. We chose this path," he said. But his words lacked the absolute conviction they had held moments before. "We sought truth beyond the limitations of earthly faith. You sought escape from the responsibilities of serving others," Brother Thomas countered. "True faith requires sacrifice, but not the abandonment of those who depend on your guidance. Look around you. See what your choice has brought to this place of learning and prayer." The seminarians looked toward the chapel doors, where the remaining students could be seen huddled in the corridor. Their young faces reflected terror and confusion as they witnessed the cosmic horror unfolding in what should have been their sanctuary. Several were weeping, their faith shattered by events that no theological education had prepared them to understand. For a moment, the blue light from the opening flickered as if the entities below were experiencing something they had not anticipated: doubt among their chosen servants. The tall figure's attention turned from Brother Thomas to the seminarians, and when it spoke, its voice carried notes of anger and urgent command. "The compact is sealed," it declared. "The willing sacrifice has been accepted. The door will not close until the 13th takes his place among the chosen." But Father Whitmore's voice rose from the depths of the opening, and for the first time in months, it sounded entirely human. I can see what this leads to," he called, his words echoing strangely off the stone walls. "The visions they showed us, they were incomplete. This path leads not to enlightenment, but to the destruction of everything we swore to protect." The seminarians turned toward the opening, their perfect synchronization broken by their superior's words. Francis Benedetto stepped closer to the edge, his face reflecting a struggle between the alien influence that had claimed him and the remnants of his humanity. "Marcus," he called down into the depths, "what do you see? What truth have they hidden from us?" Father Whitmore's response came in a voice cracked with horror and regret. "I see the world they want to create, cities of shadow where humans serve as cattle for beings that feed on faith itself. Churches transformed into breeding grounds for entities that mock everything sacred. The door they want to open, it will never close. We won't be serving a higher purpose. We'll be midwives to apocalypse." The tall figure raised its arms and the opening began to pulse with renewed intensity. The blue light took on a reddish tinge that cast everything in the chapel in the color of blood. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of eons and the promise of cosmic revenge. "The 13th witness has seen too much," it declared. "The compact will be completed whether he serves willingly or not. The door will open, and the reign of shadow will begin. Brother Thomas felt the cross in his hands growing warm, as if responding to the entity's threat. The carved wood began to emit a soft golden light that pushed back against the blue radiance rising from the depths. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of every prayer that had ever been offered in the chapel's sacred space. "Not while faith endures," he declared, "not while there are those willing to stand against the darkness." The battle for the souls of the seminarians and the fate of the world above was about to reach its climax. The chapel erupted into chaos as the forces of light and shadow clashed in a conflict that transcended physical reality. The golden radiance from Brother Thomas's cross met the red-tinged blue light from the opening, creating a barrier of pure energy that split the chapel down its center. On one side stood the 3 surviving priests and the porter, their faith blazing like a beacon in the cosmic darkness. On the other, the transformed seminarians wavered between their alien masters and their remembered humanity. The tall figure in the center of the opening raised what might have been arms, and the very stones of the chapel began to shift and change. The walls elongated, stretching upward until they seemed to touch a sky that no longer resembled anything terrestrial. The ceiling became a window into depths that hurt to perceive directly, showing vistas of underground cities populated by beings that had never known sunlight. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the entity declared, its voice now coming from every stone in the building. "The compact has been sealed with willing sacrifice. The door between worlds stands open, and the reign of shadow approaches." But Father Whitmore's voice rose from the depths with desperate urgency. "Francis, all of you, remember why you came here. Remember the vows you prepared to take. We sought to serve something greater than ourselves, but not this, never this." Francis Benedetto stepped closer to the opening, his face a battlefield between alien influence and human memory. We studied the ancient texts. We sought truth beyond the limitations of doctrine. The entities below promised us knowledge, understanding of cosmic mysteries. They promised us slavery, disguised as enlightenment." Father Whitmore interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "I can see their true purpose now. They don't want servants. They want anchors, human souls to tie their realm to ours. Every person who descends these steps makes it easier for them to manifest in the world above." The remaining seminarians looked at each other with expressions that reflected their internal struggle. The alien influence that had claimed them flickered like a guttering candle as their human consciousness fought to reassert itself. Thomas Kellerman spoke first, his voice shaking with the effort of independent thought. "The dreams they sent us, were they lies?" "Not lies," came a new voice from the depths, one of the seminarians who had descended the previous year. "But incomplete truths. They showed us the glory of cosmic knowledge while hiding the price. We are no longer human, no longer capable of the love and compassion that drew us to serve God. We have become echoes of ourselves, hollow vessels for alien will." The tall figure turned its attention to the depths, and when it spoke, its voice carried notes of urgent command. "Silence. The compact is sealed. The chosen serve willingly." But the voice from below continued. "We serve because we have no choice. The moment we descended these steps, our free will was forfeit. Don't let them claim you, Francis. Don't let them claim any more souls to their eternal darkness." Brother Thomas felt the cross in his hands growing warmer, its golden light intensifying until it illuminated every corner of the chapel. The sacred wood seemed to resonate with power drawn from centuries of faithful prayer, creating a barrier that held the entity's influence at bay. "The choice is still yours," he called to the seminarians. "Your souls haven't been fully claimed yet. You can still choose to serve the light instead of the darkness." Francis Benedetto looked at his fellow seminarians, seeing in their faces the same struggle he felt in his own heart. The alien influence that had seemed so compelling in the months leading up to their ordination now felt like chains made of shadow, binding them to purposes that mocked everything they had once held sacred. "What about Father Whitmore?" he asked. "What about those who have already descended?" The tall figure spoke before Brother Thomas could respond. "They are ours eternally. The compact cannot be broken. The door will remain open regardless of what you choose." But Father Whitmore's voice rose from the depths with surprising strength. "The compact was based on deception. We were not fully informed of the consequences. By the laws they themselves follow, incomplete knowledge invalidates consent." The entity's attention turned sharply toward the opening, and for the first time, its absolute confidence seemed to waver. When it spoke, its voice carried notes of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The chosen descended willingly. They sought knowledge and power beyond mortal understanding. "We sought to serve God," Father Whitmore replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "When we discovered that your offer required abandoning that service, we had already been changed beyond our ability to refuse. That is not willing consent, that is entrapment." The chapel began to shake as competing forces of cosmic law clashed within its walls. The opening in the floor flickered between the blue radiance that marked the entity's realm and something else, a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, older and deeper than the alien influence. Brother Thomas understood what was happening. The entities operated according to cosmic laws that governed all supernatural interactions. If Father Whitmore was correct about the nature of their consent, then the compact could indeed be challenged. But the challenge had to come from those who had been most directly affected, the seminarians themselves. "Francis," he called urgently, "you and your classmates have to choose, but this time with full knowledge of what that choice means. Will you serve entities that want to use you as anchors for invasion, or will you serve the God who called you to protect and guide his people?" Francis Benedetto looked around the chapel one final time, seeing it not as the transformed nightmare it had become, but as the place where he had spent 6 years preparing to dedicate his life to service. The alien influence that had seemed so compelling now revealed itself as the trap it had always been, a promise of cosmic knowledge that came at the price of everything that made existence meaningful. "I choose," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I choose to serve the light, not the darkness. I choose to protect the innocent, not enable their destruction. I choose." He paused, looking directly at the tall figure that had claimed so many souls. "I choose to reject your compact and everything it represents." One by one, the other seminarians made the same choice, their voices joining in a declaration that created harmonics of pure human will. The blue light from the opening began to flicker and dim as the alien influence lost its hold on their souls. The tall figure raised its arms in apparent rage, and the chapel's walls began to crack under the force of cosmic displeasure. "The compact cannot be broken," it declared. "The door will remain open. Others will follow the path you have rejected." But Brother Thomas stepped forward, the cross in his hands blazing with golden radiance that pushed back the darkness. "The compact is broken," he declared with absolute authority. "The chosen have withdrawn their consent with full knowledge of the consequences. By your own laws, they are free." The opening in the chapel floor began to change, the blue radiance giving way to something far older and more powerful. From the depths came not the alien presence that had claimed so many souls, but the voice of the earth itself, ancient, patient, and infinitely compassionate. "The door between realms will be sealed," the voice declared in words that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. "The compact is indeed broken. Those who descended under false pretenses will be given the choice to return, their humanity restored." The tall figure began to fade, its form becoming translucent as its connection to the world above was severed. As it disappeared, its final words echoed through the chapel with the promise of future threat. "The door may be sealed, but others will find ways to open it. The reign of shadow is inevitable. We are patient. We will wait." But its voice grew fainter with each word until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the warm, golden light that filled every corner of the chapel. From the opening came the sound of footsteps on stone stairs. Not the mechanical procession of the transformed, but the hesitant steps of human beings choosing to return to the light. Father Whitmore emerged first, his face bearing the marks of his ordeal, but his eyes clear and human once more. Behind him came the 12 seminarians who had descended the previous year, their white vestments no longer gleaming with alien radiance, but simply the cloth of young men who had faced ultimate darkness and chosen to reject it. The dawn of May 15th, 1848, broke over Saint Augustine Seminary like a blessing after the longest night in the institution's history. The chapel, which had been a battleground between cosmic forces just hours before, now appeared exactly as it had for over 20 years. The floor was solid stone, with no trace of the opening that had led to realms of shadow. The altar stood in its proper place, unmarked by the supernatural forces that had moved it. Only the lingering scent of something indefinably clean and pure gave any indication of the momentous events that had transpired. Father Whitmore knelt before the altar, his hands clasped in prayer that came from the depths of a soul that had journeyed to the edge of damnation and found its way back to grace. The 12 seminarians who had been lost for an entire year knelt beside him, their faces reflecting the complex mixture of gratitude and sorrow that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed them utterly. Brother Thomas stood at the chapel's entrance, still holding the carved cross that had proven to be their salvation. The ancient wood had returned to its normal appearance, but he could feel the power that resided within it, not alien or otherworldly, but deeply, fundamentally human. It was the accumulated faith of centuries, the prayers of countless souls who had sought comfort and guidance in their darkest hours. The students who had witnessed the night's events huddled in the corridor beyond, their young faces reflecting confusion and fear that would take years to fully process. They had seen their faith tested in ways that no theological education could have prepared them for, but they had also seen that faith triumph over forces that sought to corrupt and destroy it. Father Mills, Father Brennan, and Father Kowalski gathered around their superior, their relief evident in every gesture. They had watched Father Whitmore walk voluntarily into damnation, and now they could hardly believe that he stood among them once more, his humanity restored and his faith stronger than ever. "How do we explain this?" Father Brennan asked quietly. "How do we tell the church hierarchy what really happened here?" Father Whitmore looked up from his prayers, his eyes clear and purposeful. "We tell them the truth," he said simply. "All of it. The entities that sought to use our seminary as an anchor point for invasion. The seminarians who were deceived into believing they were serving a higher purpose. The cosmic laws that govern supernatural contracts. Everything. And if they don't believe us," Father Kowalski asked, "then we'll show them the evidence." Father Whitmore replied, gesturing toward a leather-bound journal that lay on the altar. The book had appeared when the seminarians emerged from the depths, its pages filled with detailed accounts of their experiences in the realm below. Francis and his classmates have documented everything they saw and experienced. The underground cities, the entities that rule there, the cosmic laws that govern their interactions with our world. It's all there. Francis Benedetto, who had been silent since his return from the depths, finally spoke. "We saw what they wanted to do to our world," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experiences that had aged him beyond his years. "The entities below don't seek to destroy humanity outright. They want to transform it, to make us willing servants in a cosmic order that denies everything sacred and beautiful about existence. Oh, they showed us visions of the future they were working toward," Thomas Kellerman added. "Cities where humans lived in constant fear, where faith itself had been corrupted into a tool of oppression and despair. They wanted to use our seminary as a template, a place where future priests would be trained to serve their purposes instead of God's." Brother Thomas set the cross carefully on a nearby pew and approached the group of priests and seminarians. "The question now is what we do with this knowledge. Do we close the seminary and pretend none of this happened? Do we relocate and start fresh somewhere else? Or do we stay and ensure that what happened here never happens again?" Father Whitmore stood, his decision already made. "We stay," he declared. This place has been tested by forces that sought to corrupt it, and it has emerged stronger. The entities below chose this location because it sits on ground that was sacred long before Christianity arrived in the New World. That sacredness protected us when our faith alone might not have been enough. But the students, Father Mills protested, their families will never trust us again. The reputation of this place will be rebuilt through our actions, Father Whitmore interrupted. We'll be more careful about who we accept as seminarians. We'll study the warning signs that led to Francis and his classmates being vulnerable to alien influence. We'll teach future priests not just theology and doctrine, but how to recognize and resist supernatural threats that seek to corrupt the Church from within. Francis Benedetto looked at his former superior with something approaching awe. You want us to stay, after what we did, what we almost caused? You were deceived, Father Whitmore replied gently, shown partial truths, and led to believe that abandoning your earthly responsibilities would lead to greater service. The entities below are masters of manipulation, able to make the darkest choices seem like acts of divine inspiration. Your mistake was in believing that true faith requires abandoning the world instead of serving it. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of carriages approaching the seminary. Through the chapel windows, they could see a procession of black vehicles making their way up the hill. Church officials from Philadelphia, no doubt responding to Father Kowalski's urgent letters. Bishop Kenrick himself sat in the lead carriage, his face grave with concern. They're here sooner than expected, Father Brennan observed. Good, Father Whitmore replied. The sooner we tell them what really happened, the sooner we can begin the work of rebuilding. As the church officials entered the seminary, Father Whitmore gathered the leather-bound journal and prepared to tell a story that would challenge every assumption about the nature of faith, the reality of supernatural threats, and the responsibility of religious institutions to protect both their members and the world at large. The investigation that followed lasted 3 weeks and involved theologians, historians, and even representatives of the Vatican's most secretive departments. The evidence presented by Father Whitmore and the returned seminarians was exhaustive and undeniable. The journal they had brought back from the depths contained information that could not have been fabricated. Detailed descriptions of cosmic laws, alien technologies, and supernatural hierarchies that matched ancient texts found in the Vatican's most restricted archives. In the end, the Church made a decision that would affect Catholic institutions throughout the United States. Saint Augustine Seminary would remain open, but it would be transformed into something new, a training ground not just for priests, but for those called to defend the faith against supernatural threats. The curriculum would include studies in comparative mythology, cosmic law, and the recognition of alien influences that sought to corrupt religious institutions. The 12 seminarians who had been lost for a year chose to continue their studies, but their ordination was delayed by 2 additional years while they underwent intensive counseling and retraining. They had seen too much, experienced too much, to simply return to the traditional path of priestly service. Instead, they would become specialists in identifying and countering supernatural threats to the Church. Francis Benedetto, whose intellectual brilliance had made him a target for the entities below, devoted himself to creating a comprehensive guide for recognizing alien influence. His work would eventually be distributed to seminaries throughout the Catholic world, helping to prevent future incidents like the one that had nearly destroyed Saint Augustine. Brother Thomas was elevated to Father Thomas and placed in charge of the seminary's new Department of Supernatural Defense. The carved cross that had saved them all was enshrined in a place of honor, its power serving as both protection and reminder of the faith that had triumphed over cosmic darkness. As the years passed, Saint Augustine Seminary developed a reputation as the most secure religious institution in the United States. Stories spread throughout Catholic communities about the priests who had faced ultimate darkness and emerged with their faith stronger than ever. Young men who felt called to defend the Church against supernatural threats applied to study there, creating a new generation of clergy equipped to handle threats that ordinary theological education could never address. Father Whitmore continued to serve as the seminary superior until his death in 1889. His final words, according to Father Benedetto, who was present at his bedside, were, "The door remains sealed, but vigilance is eternal. Tell them never to forget what we learned. That faith without knowledge is vulnerability, and knowledge without faith is corruption." The basement beneath the chapel remained sealed, but it was no longer empty. Church architects had filled it with blessed concrete and installed a series of monitoring devices that would detect any attempt to reopen the passage to the depths. The readings from these devices, checked daily by members of the Department of Supernatural Defense, showed no unusual activity for over 50 years. But in 1899, exactly 52 years after the original incident, the monitors detected something that made Father Benedetto, now the seminary's superior, call for immediate assistance from Rome. The reading showed not an attempt to reopen the passage, but something far more disturbing. A message transmitted through cosmic frequencies that no earthly technology should have been able to detect. The message was brief but chilling. "The compact may be broken, but the work continues. Others have learned from your resistance. New doors will be opened in places where vigilance has grown weak. The reign of shadow approaches through paths you have not considered." This discovery led to the creation of a global network of institutions dedicated to monitoring and countering supernatural threats to religious organizations. The lessons learned at Saint Augustine Seminary spread throughout the Catholic Church and beyond, creating an invisible army of defenders who stood guard against forces that sought to corrupt faith itself. Today, more than a century and 70 years after the events of 1847, Saint Augustine Seminary still stands on its hill in Pennsylvania. The building houses a theological college that trains priests in traditional doctrine, but it also serves as the headquarters for an organization that few people know exists. The Collegium Defensorum Fidei, the College of Faith's Defenders. The chapel where cosmic forces once clashed remains in use for daily mass and special ceremonies. Visitors often comment on the sense of peace that pervades the space, unaware that they are standing on ground where human faith once triumphed over alien corruption. The altar beneath which lay the door to otherworldly realms bears a simple inscription that few people notice. "Faith tested in fire burns brighter." The story of the 12 seminarians who descended into darkness and returned to light serves as both warning and inspiration for those called to defend faith against supernatural threats. It reminds us that the greatest dangers to religious institutions come not from external persecution, but from internal corruption, from those who would use sacred spaces and trusted positions to serve purposes that mock everything religion is meant to protect. But it also reminds us that faith, when properly understood and courageously applied, has the power to triumph over any darkness. The entities that sought to claim Saint Augustine Seminary represented forces older than human civilization, armed with knowledge that spanned cosmic ages. Yet they were defeated by the simple courage of ordinary men who chose to serve light instead of shadow, truth instead of deception, love instead of power. The basement beneath Saint Augustine Seminary remains sealed to this day, its concrete barriers monitored by technology that bridges the gap between science and faith. The readings show no unusual activity, suggesting that the door to the depths remains permanently closed. But those who work in the Department of Supernatural Defense know that vigilance is the price of spiritual freedom, and that the forces of darkness are always seeking new ways to corrupt and claim human souls. In the end, the story of the priests who never said their first Mass serves as a reminder that faith is not passive acceptance, but active resistance to everything that seeks to diminish or corrupt it. The 12 young men who were prepared to serve God in traditional ways instead became warriors in a cosmic battle that most people never realize is being fought. Their ordination came not in a ceremony of pageantry and celebration, but in the moment they chose to reject alien promises and return to the light that had called them in the first place. This mystery shows us that the greatest threats to faith come not from those who openly oppose it, but from those who would corrupt it from within, transforming sacred institutions into tools of spiritual slavery. Yet it also demonstrates that faith, properly understood and courageously applied, possesses power that transcends any earthly understanding. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that such cosmic battles between light and darkness continue in places where vigilance has grown weak? Leave your comment below, sharing your thoughts about faith, sacrifice, and the hidden defenders who stand guard against supernatural threats. If you enjoyed this tale of cosmic horror and religious mystery, subscribe now and hit the notification bell to never miss stories that explore the darkest corners of religious history. Share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge our understanding of faith and reality. Remember, this channel is only for those brave enough to face truths that others fear to acknowledge. See you in the next investigation into the mysteries that history has tried to forget.